So today I'm going to be talking about some ways to assess compaction in a field. I have three tools out here. The first one is a penetrometer, which measures penetrometer resistance. It has a dial on the top. There's two different size tips that we can use. Typically the larger or the 3/4 inch tip is used in looser soils or sandy soils, and then the smaller tip, the 1/2 inch tip, we use for more silty soils or clay soils. So what we're doing, we're trying to measure when we hit a restrictive layer. And what we say is when you hit 300 psi, that can be root limiting. It will limit root penetration. So it's best to work with a partner. These marks here, I don't know if you can see them, but they're every 4 inches. So you want to take it and make constant pressure down through the field, and then I hit compaction there, so my partner would notice what depth I am at that point, and then you want to keep pushing and see when you push through it. Right here I finally pushed through it, but I'm at 2 foot. That's pretty deep compaction. That's going to be hard to deal with. But let's say we had a layer that started at 8 inches and then went to 16 inches, then we would know that is a depth that we need to address, maybe with deep tillage, subsoil tillage. So this works well. It gives you a quantitative number where you can actually know, hey, I'm reaching that yield limiting value. So this is the gauge. There's two different scales here. If you're using the larger tip, like for the sandy soils, you would use the outside range. And if you're using the smaller tip, you would use the inside range. Either one for the appropriate tip size, when you hit 300 psi, you're going to get into the red reading. So make sure you're looking at the right scale on the gauge, and then have someone mark it when you hit 300 and then the depth that you push through. So here we have increments every 4 inches, and it's best to have your partner mark down. You tell them when you hit it, and they should be able to tell you where you were when you hit the compaction, and then when you break through it, if you do break through it, you record that depth, so then you have a targeted depth to try to alleviate. Another thing to mention with this tool, and any of these tools, you need to have proper soil moisture. If it's too dry, that's going to give you a false reading. It also detects when you start picking up other changes in the soil. So if you have a clay pan at 24 inches, you might start detecting that. But it's best to have the similar soil moisture content all the way through the profile, so you're not having your differences influenced by soil moisture rather than the soil penetrometer resistance. So ideally we're working with a partner. I'm pushing this into the ground. I'm not reaching any limiting layer, and now I'm getting close. I never did hit a limiting layer until that depth, and now we're pushing it through. So we ended up with a limiting layer around 22 inches. So that's really deeper than we can address with most soil field operations. If I move over here to another spot, we might not find a limiting layer, or we'll find one at a much shallower depth. Right there we were at about 6 inches. I pushed through. Finally I break through that compacted layer. We're at about 26 inches. So this is going to be something also that's probably going to be hard to address because it's so deep. So this is another tool we can use to identify compacted layers. It's not as accurate as a penetrometer as far as telling you what your penetrometer resistance is, but you use it in the same manner. You can push it through the soil till you hit a root limiting layer or a hard layer. We hit it about 5 inches here. We can move to another spot and might not hit it at 5 inches. Well, there's another 5 or so inches. But let's move over here to another spot, and it goes through pretty good until we hit about a foot. So it's a similar concept as the penetrometer resistance, but this is more by feel versus by a gauge telling you how compacted a soil is. You can also do the same thing with a soil probe when the soil conditions are adequate. So this is just the same soil probe that you would take your soil samples with. If you go in here, I believe we shouldn't have too much compaction based on the previous thing, and I can push it in pretty easy until I get, that is about 12 inches. Now we'll move over to where we know we have a compacted layer and push it in, and you can feel it get pretty tight at about 4 inches. Same concept as with the tiling probe and the penetrometer. It's giving you an idea of where you're hitting a root limiting layer. Another thing I'd like to mention about all these tools, just because you find compaction in one spot doesn't mean you need to subsoil the whole field. You want to address the whole field, so go through the field in different places, and if you only find like a few areas that may be from field traffic or something, that's the area that you need to address. That doesn't necessarily mean I find 2 tight spots in a 50-acre field that I need to run a subsoiler over the whole 50-acre field. Address those problem areas and keep your ripper out of the field if you don't need to run it. So these are just some tools that we can use to identify potentially yield limiting compaction layers in your crop field.